Aside from pornography magazines, do any men read explicit romance novels like some women do? I am referring to straightforward explicit romance books. Story 1. I found a book in the forest once when I was a kid, as is tradition. It was a collection of erotic stories and readers' letters to a famous adult magazine, similar to Literotica in paperback form. I read it cover to cover several times. Story 2. I read A Court of Thorns and Roses a couple of months ago because I wanted to read a smut book and improve my sexting skills. It was not as smutty as I thought it would be, although women have told me the later books get smuttier. I might read more, but I am definitely more of a visual smut person. I gave it a chance. Story 3. I will apparently deviate from the norm here and admit I do. Literotica is a frequent page visited. I enjoy knowing why people are having sex. Just watching people having sex does not always fit the need. Even when I am watching pornography, I make up a story in my head about why this young woman is involved. I will admit that the reading is often just a warm-up, and I switch over to the visuals as it really helps me reach climax if the stories are not enough. And now you all know far too much about my personal habits. Story 4. Yes, I have also written it. The issue many men here are having is that most of it is written for women. The material written for men has more visual descriptions and more detailed descriptions of the action. It focuses more on what the characters feel, rather than how they feel. Story 5. Gay man here. I read adult content and write it. It probably has to do with me having some very niche interests that are almost never represented in adult material. So I have to create my own. Story 6. No, not interested. Generally speaking, men are turned on by what they see, women by what they hear or read. Story 7. I started reading A Court of Thorns and Roses, recommended by a good friend, and enjoyed the world building and narrative pacing. However, I gave up after the first book when the romance became too much for me. It felt transparent, unrelatable from Fair's perspective, and unexciting regarding the male love interests, as I am straight. It is simply not written for men. Story 8. I attempted to read the book because my ex, who was just becoming my girlfriend at the time, was really into one book series and I wanted to understand her more. I also wanted to see what interested her and explore the world of what women fantasize about to maybe improve how I approach relationships. I somewhat liked the main male character in some aspects, so I read it. The book is not for everyone, and it gets very unrealistic. You can tell a woman wrote it, especially for a woman's fantasy, with no real intention for a man to read it. But the idea of the character being this intimidating figure, a vigilante of sorts, more like a Punisher type figure, being a badass and protective, and having the confidence to be morally gray, is something many men might wish to embody. Many of us fantasize about being a dark figure who can save people in gritty ways and get a very attractive woman to love us despite our flaws. However, other parts, the chase and borderline toxic or morally wrong and creepy things the main character does, which absolutely would not be desired by women in real life but somehow are fantasized about, are very disturbing or just stupid. The book is written in chapters that shift perspectives between the male and female main characters. I only somewhat enjoyed the dark fantasy side of the male protagonist but found myself rolling my eyes trying to get through the female protagonist's parts. I only got somewhat engaged when the male protagonist was off performing anti-hero tactics or being protective. I do like dark and twisted themes sometimes. I like misunderstood vigilantes and anti-heroes. I enjoy gritty, dark shows and movies, and occasionally, I appreciate darker fantasy. But I highly doubt a large majority of men would tolerate the book or not laugh at wasting their time with it. I indulged because she tried to be into my comic book characters and understand them. Story 9. I find the ones written for men tend to be of the her breasts bounced noticeably with each thrust of Max Power's large, monument-like member variety, while the ones for women that I have read tend to either be too tame, such as she exposed her ankles, her face flushed red with excitement, or extremely explicit. Story 10. Read the Fourth Wing series and enjoyed it, though not for the explicit content. I also tried A Court of Thorns and Roses. I simply do not like the dark, brooding, dominant male characters these books seem to have, and the female leads who dislike them at first, but then fall for them and cannot live without them. It seems very young adult, for lack of a better term. I would enjoy a well-written, mature book but have not yet found one that suits my style. Story 11. I like to open up literatice.com every once in a while. They have some pretty good stories, to be honest. Some don't even contain sexual content, and they're still good. There are a lot of stories that are good and mix in sexual content here and there instead of making it the sole theme. I think imagination is more powerful than any adult content you're ever going to watch. I watch adult content to get inspiration on breasts, but I still like to imagine my hypothetical stepmother having to sit on my lap during a long car ride to college, where my non-existent father is driving and my non-existent stepmother is scantily clad as she relaxes in my lap, and the temperature is hot. It's fun. Story 12. I came across a collection of long-arm novels when I was in the Navy. It is an Old West-themed men's romance fantasy. I sometimes enjoy it, and I honestly think women write it better. Story 13. I think many men read explicit books but do not think of or speak of them as explicit. Male-oriented books with explicit content tend to focus on action, adventure, and power fantasies, such as science fiction and fantasy novels mostly centered around guns, swords, space warfare, or similar themes. Otherwise, they are similar to women's explicit content, with the driving force of the novel interrupted by occasional intimate scenes. Then there is manga, much of which consists of constant fan service, yet people do not generally consider it explicit even though there are many depictions of nudity. These works are mostly action, adventure, and power fantasies, although recently they have shifted toward more grounded slice-of-life themes, such as being skilled at farming, running a shop or similar activities, and gathering a group of attractive women. The common pattern reflects the classic male fantasy or desire to be appreciated as a warrior and provider. Story 14. I have read a few, but they are always from a woman's recommendation. Men are more visual creatures, so pictures are better for our brains. Story 15. I wanted to learn how to write romance. My manager recommended the A Court of Thorns and Roses books. I read the first 3. They were not bad. The first one is actually pretty great. I went back to full-on fantasy later. Story 16. I tried. I honestly dislike how they are written. They use unpleasant words to describe sex, and the dirty talk is very poorly done. I found myself getting more angry than anything else. In general, the story built around the sex scenes is also written poorly. I cannot engage with them on that aspect. Additionally, all the leads are so interchangeable that it is not even amusing. All the male leads look the same except for a few differences. The female characters have more care put into them, but they still generally read the same to me. I end up knowing what is going to happen before the next page, and for some reason, it is not as enjoyable as when I can predict what will happen in a movie. Story 17. Technically, I did read explicit content. I used to do a lot of pure text role-playing games as a teenager, and that always turned to romance. So I suppose every time I did read and answer, it was explicit content. Story 18. A long time ago, I read a lot of erotica and even wrote some. I didn't feel the need for that anymore once I got married. More recently, my wife has been reading a lot of steamy novels like Stephanie Archer's books. She talks a lot about how explicit they are, so I figured I would read some to see what was so good. I thought they were pretty boring. Most of the books felt like watching a grown woman play with Barbies. The characters were all predictable and the dialogue felt unnatural. The men were very obviously written by a woman in a way that is difficult to describe. When the books did get to sex scenes, they honestly weren't dirty enough. Sure, they may have been more realistic than trashy internet erotica, but the author had to stay committed to these being real books with actual plots. The scenes would eventually end and bring you back into the rest of the plot that you didn't really care about. Overall, if I want to masturbate, then I want to masturbate. I don't want to wade through hours of will they / won't they. Story 19. Because if I am reading erotic literature, it has to be part of a genuinely good world and narrative. 99% of erotic books are the literary equivalent of stick figure drawings, crudely and amateurishly written, with vague or explicit dialogue. It is beneath me, literally too poor in quality to bother reading. Story 20. Well, I do not like to, but for some reason, every science fiction author for the last 6 decades felt they had to include a strange sex scene in every single book. Story 21. As a frequent reader on Literotica and a few other sites, I have tried about 24 adult-themed books, but usually they feel too long and the sex scenes are somewhat weak. Some of my friends and I sometimes recommend books to each other. Story 22, fanfiction, yes. I also write explicit fanfiction. However, when it comes to reading explicit books, I have not gotten into any. Mainly because I do not want any plot when I read, just the explicit content. Story 23. Amateurish, poorly written space opera science fiction with awesome space battles is my smut. Do not judge. Story 24. They are never even good, so no. They are clearly not marketed toward us. It is like video pornography, which is very heavily marketed toward men specifically. Books are heavily marketed toward women specifically. And that is okay. Not everything has to be completely equal. Story 25. I was assembling a cabinet from IKEA and the instructions were tricky. I mean, insert part B into slot, scandalous. Vedham. More like, Veddayam. Story 26. Exit to Eden has the best intimate scene in anything I have come across. Beauty series features bondage themes. Valley of the Mammoth or something similar. I read a book about mothers. Gore series is adolescent fiction. Vampire stories by Anne Rice. I have varied reading tastes. I grew up when adult material was available in black and white. Story 27. I cannot begin to express how much men are missing out by not reading erotic literature. Pornography, in comparison, rates 0 out of 10 on the heat scale compared to erotic literature. Good erotic literature is like being doused in gasoline and set on fire in terms of intensity. It makes pornography look ordinary. Honestly, one of the hottest things I can imagine is doing a buddy read or annotated read of a spicy book with a woman. Story 28. It is pretty lame, which is why. Power to you for liking what you like. But reading about that is boring. I am the type of reader who really imagines the scenes and characters beyond the page. As a kid, reading about sex was interesting, but after experiencing it myself, it quickly felt mundane to read about. Story 29. I read a couple of stories about 15 years ago. They are written for women to read. If you want stories written for men, go to literotica.com. Story 30. Yes, I have written it before and have been considering starting again and publishing on Literotica. I have never been turned on by watching pornography. I prefer to read and write it. Story 31. I think many romance novels take a female perspective. Romance is something that happens to the female protagonist. It is hard for a straight male audience to relate because romance and courting require a lot of effort. It does not just happen as it is often portrayed. Story 32. I do. It's great, I love it. But I mostly use it to palate cleanse from other things I'm reading. I won't let anybody convince me that reading about a magical college with dragons, fights, and adult content isn't fun. Story 33. I read romance books all the time. I am not really into them for the explicit content, but I enjoy the better human stories. Story 34. I would never think of looking for it. It seems like a waste of time since video exists. However, I have come across it a few times in my life and enjoyed it very much. Maybe I should look for it. Story 35. About Done with Butcher and Blackbird. I recently created a thread in another subreddit asking for recommendations. I like knowing what excites women, so it is like spicy research. Story 36. The top comment is right. What we see is key. However, some caption pictures might set the tone of the fantasy. We don't want to read a long novel, but 2 sentences on the screen are enough. Think of a picture of an attractive girl with the caption, "Hey stepbrother, our parents are on a date again tonight and you know how that goes." That type of content is out there. But seriously, we went through 17 other pictures and videos looking for just the right scene. Am I in the mood for gothic-looking girls today? I mean, yeah, let's focus on gothic girls. But, damn, gothic stepsister? Nah. Ooh, I know, dominatrix. And not gothic enough. And the scenes involving. That, I mean, she is attractive, but... thick Latina dominatrix. Okay, admittedly, I should have known that wasn't going to work out how I wanted. Seriously, none of these tabs I have open are going to do it for me? I just can't really find the video. Yeah, I know you. There's the intimacy I have been lacking. Story 37. I don't recall seeing a book like this written to target a male audience. Do you have any suggested titles? I have definitely enjoyed reading the story sections of some websites online. Story 38. As an 18-year-old man, reading some erotic literature one night was the only time in my life I have ever reached climax without any manual stimulation whatsoever. It was intense, steamy, and I was very aroused. Many years later, as a lifelong fetishist, I enjoy fetish literature that focuses on the mental aspects of my interests, although less frequently with age. Story 39. All right, you caught me. I made a bet with my wife that I would read A Court of Thorns and Roses if she watched X-Men 97. It's actually a pretty solid book with a good story. Story 40. She walked into the bar wearing a provocative Cam Chancellor jersey. She asked the bartender to put on Walter Jones highlights. I could tell she knew football a little but still needed a man to explain it to her. Then, she ordered me a prime rib and paid for it but made sure my friends thought that I paid for it. Story 41. Broaden it out to fiction in general, sure. It stimulates the brain in a different way, and if it helps to have an emotional bond to fuel the imagination, then written fiction is one of the easiest and best ways to convey those types of emotions. You can lose yourself in a scenario like that, especially if the characterization is good. Put another way, I am a bookworm by nature, so of course that appeals to me. Story 42. Nope. The closest I ever got was Don't Stand Too Close to a Naked Man by Tim Allen. Great book by an awesome guy, but porn? No. Story 43. I used to read Playboy after thoroughly studying the pictures. The articles were always interesting and rarely seemed erotic. Even they new men are mostly visual. Story 44. If I am looking for extremely hyperspecific kink content, it is sometimes only available in text. However, I cannot say I have read anything longer than a few pages, except for the occasional hentai game. Story 45. I will read and write some erotica. I do not want a novel or a long backstory before it becomes explicit. Story 46. In my 20s, I used to buy Penthouse Forum, which featured sex stories. These days, I use Gone Wild Stories, which is free. Story 47. Well, sort of. Most of it, if not all, I read online and not in book form, certainly nothing I suspect you would likely find in the women's romance section of a bookstore. Though if someone who knew me somewhat recommended and lent me one, I would likely at least try it. Way back when, I used to buy and read magazines like Penthouse Letters. I also had around that time a book or two of classic erotic short stories. Now I read erotic stories online, such as ones from Literotica and similar sites. Much of the Literotica categories I gravitate towards are romance, erotic couplings, first time, mature, novels and novellas, taboo and incest, non-human, science fiction and fantasy. I am least likely to look at anal, cross-dressing, bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, masochism, fan fiction and celebrities, chain stories, fetish, gay male, interracial love, transgender, and reluctant or non-consent. I also read certain fan fiction sites that have R-rated stories with sex, along with hentai manga, which is similar to erotic graphic novels or comics. Some of it is non-human or science fiction, and some branches out into the anthropomorphic realm, such as FIM fiction, so furry, and the furry category along with many other categories on luscious.net. Some of the stories online are really well-written long stories that just have a sex aspect in them. Some of them are shorter, with the plot and character development being secondary at best. Story 48. I have a great imagination and can really immerse myself in the scene. I am not going to say what I am reading, but I do not judge it. Story 49. Men are turned on visually, and women are turned on emotionally. It makes sense that adult content for men would be visual, while content for women would be story-driven. To quote a certain comedian, when women watch strippers, the male strippers all have jobs too. Like, ooh, he's a sexy fireman. Or, ooh, he's a sexy lawyer. When men get strippers, they have one job, and that job is stripping. Story 50. Aside from men generally being more responsive to visual stimuli than anything else, I do think there are some nuances. There are many men in the subreddit r/hotpast who enjoy reading, hearing, and sharing sexual stories involving their partners. There are other subreddits about explicit confessions, wild stories, and so on. Some men do enjoy this. I do sometimes. I mentioned this post to my wife. She pointed out there are not many explicit books targeted toward men. I also mentioned there is a stigma. If a woman is reading an explicit book on the bus or at Barnes & Noble, people would not think much about it. But if a man were reading an explicit book in public, the general reaction would be, call the authorities on that pervert. In general, once a man is aroused, he wants to climax. Women are better at handling a slow, steady buildup. They can let that flame burn for a while. Thus, even the explicit literature men do read is short and generally intended for quick arousal. I enjoy reading explicit stories sometimes. I think part of it is my age, 46, some erectile dysfunction, and that my wife and I have a very playful, fantasy, and sexy talk sex life. So either of us reading sexy stories gives us fuel for the bedroom. Story 51. Do you count dark fantasy smut? Lothair Enemy of the Old, McReeve, and pretty much the entire Immortals After Dark by Cressley Cole series. Vampires and werewolves finding love and having steamy sex is just right up my alley. I also read more wholesome romance dark fantasy books like the Blood of Eden series. Forgot the author. That one follows a singular story throughout the series. The other series is a collection of fantasy smut stories that aren't exactly related to each other, unless one of the books connects them all. There is no smut in the Blood of Eden. It's more of a fantasy horror adventure with romance sprinkled in. A really good series, highly recommend. Story 52. I like to read it in a woman's ear while she lies naked on top of me. My favorite is when the woman is suffering for attention from her main partner because he has a new partner and goes on an intense, passionate effort trying to regain it. Always so much passion. Story 53. I have never really given it a try. At best, I have seen or heard of explicit scripts and audios, but I have never actually read explicit content. Story 54. I listen to and read explicit romance. I have just finished one called Priest. I openly admit that I enjoy reading not only explicit romance but also all kinds of romance. Story 55. When I am looking for explicit content, I want to look at it. It just does not feel right in text form. I can have explicit content in my literature, but I do not want my explicit content to be literature. Story 56. I have frequently heard that men prefer visual media for this sort of content. However, I enjoy well-written erotic stories sometimes, especially if they explore otherwise hard-to-access kinks. Erotic audio recordings are also fantastic. I really enjoy hearing people express emotions and enjoy themselves. Story 57. Hell yeah, I don't care much for video pornography at all. I'm in the film and television business, and the quality of production, acting, and scripts is just terrible. I like good erotica with plot and characters that make the hot sex meaningful smut. Phone in left hand, tablet propped up, or laptop on the left side. All good. Story 58. I was interested in what the 50 Shades of Grey hype was, so I read the first book. It was good, so I read the rest of the series. Story 59. I used to read literary erotica stories, but I mostly rely on my imagination and memories. I am not trying to read over 100 pages of the same thing. I like variety. Story 60. I've read a few books over the years with some engaging scenes in them. I can definitely see why they are popular, but I have never picked any solely because they are explicit. I love how books can describe scenes in ways that no image can match. I think Game of Thrones had some moderately intense scenes, and the Night Angel trilogy as well. Chuck Palahniuk has written some provocative content too, but it is usually mixed with unusual elements. I am always open to suggestions. Story 61. My friend with benefits reads this material all the time, and it feels like it is doing 95% of the work for me. I do not know what is in those novels, but sometimes I want to understand what she is reading to make her so fun. Story 62. I do often, as I am an avid reader with a vivid imagination. It is exclusively for personal purposes, though. I do not want my casual reading to be inappropriate. It is often combined with pictures or video. Story 63. I read Asa Akira's first autobiography. It is quite explicit with details, but at the time I was trying to read a variety of life stories. I started with Brock Lesnar's autobiography, then moved to Asa Akira's, and then to a book about an African child soldier. After that last book, I switched to stories about people who suffered severe human rights abuses and had horrible lives. Having written that and read it, it does seem somewhat intense. Story 64. Sometimes I read books that my wife has read, such as Court of Thorns and Roses, because I know it means a lot to her to discuss them with me. Story 65. An ex of mine read paranormal gothic romance religiously, and I tried to get into it. It was way too predictable. However, I spent a night in jail and all they had were romance books on the cart. I picked out a Viking romance novel, and it was captivating. Story 66. I know there are men out there who read smutty books. It is totally fine, to each their own, but I personally am a visual person. I do not get satisfaction from reading or imagination alone. Story 67. I do not usually read romance novels because they are generally geared towards women, but I do enjoy reading adult fiction. Story 68. I read and sometimes try to write adult fanfiction. I am both a visual person and someone who is able to use imagination for pleasure. Some of the best solo orgasms I have had were from reading particularly good adult fanfiction. Story 69. For me, it is more that none that are written with anything beyond a primitive brain are written for men or in a style I like. Story 70. I do sometimes, yes. I used to read books and novels a lot more before I had a smartphone. So not that often anymore, but when I read, I would read smutty books sometimes. In fact, for me, reading erotica is about as sexually stimulating as pornography. I read some on Reddit occasionally. Story 71. A woman I worked with showed me the adult content she was interested in. It was set in a bar in rural America, so it was not that unusual. She was excited to share it with me and said, "This won't even appear on Google." I thanked her for showing it to me, saying it looked interesting. I did not have the heart to tell her that I would rather stick to videos that my friends recommend. Story 72. Personally, I find interactive text-based programs interesting, but books not so much. I grew up with a game called The Leather Goddesses of Phobos. Story 73. I did so at one point by accident. The book had a cool sword, and the synopsis did not say anything unusual. I was about 15 years old. It turned out to be the 6th book in a science fiction adult series. Story 74. I enjoy erotic literature when my brain is too tired from adult content. It is a nice change of pace. Otherwise, adult content does the trick. Story 75. Smutty books are more of a woman thing than a man thing. Most men I know would just look at a picture of a naked woman or something to get aroused, not read a book. I am not judging women when I say that. It's just a different strokes for different folks kind of thing. Story 76. I've read the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. A couple of women seemed embarrassed to tell me they had read it. I don't know if it counts as explicit content, but they appeared to think it was. I thought it was pretty tame. However, I also enjoy adult content, so maybe my preferences are different. Story 77. There is a subreddit for audio adult content where people read and perform audio stories. It is quite popular. Recordings featuring women are the most upvoted. Story 78. I do. It's fun, not going to lie. I've always been a book reader and got into dark romance a couple of years ago. Story 79. Plenty of men read erotic literature. For sure. If you disagree, then you are not part of that group, and that is okay. We are a minority, but we do exist. Story 80. I read the Throne of Glass series since a friend recommended it. It was a good series, but honestly, I found myself bored with the sex scenes. Same with Outlander. Edit. I started A Court of Thorns and Roses too, but they are not as good compared to the other series. Story 81. No, men want love. There has never been love portrayed in any of those books, only lust. Even if love were portrayed, neither character represents you, so it is pointless. Story 82. I have read short erotic stories before as a form of entertainment, but they do not affect me sexually at all, not even a little bit. Visual pornography usually produces an immediate arousal, even if it is just images. I would not waste my time reading erotic stories for sexual gratification because it would not work. Erotic content as part of an overall enjoyable work of literature is interesting and adds to a book, but I would not use it for self-pleasure. Story 83. Not even sure how to answer this. I generally only read boring software documentation, legal contracts, and the occasional comic. Story 84. I read a lot. If it has mature content, I won't skip it. Can be fun, but it is not the main reason I choose to read any book in particular. There is nothing wrong with a little bit of cheekiness. Story 85. If I am going to read, I am going to read a book that is actually good, not just pretentious pornography. And if I am feeling aroused, I am going to look at real pornography, not just pretentious pornography. Story 86. Yes. I fell down a book talk thread and thought, it can't possibly be that horny. Credence is really that horny. Story 87. I read smart science fiction by an author who goes by Snack Guy. Fantastic stories, 8-foot-tall cat girls, lizard girl aliens, and the world building is excellent. There is a lot of adult content, but great character development and pacing, and the action is extraordinary. I have seen a lot of adult content in science fiction and historical fiction as well. And do not get me started on fantasy. Any man who says men do not read adult content either is not a reader or is not reading the right books. Story 88. Men are attracted to what they see, and women are attracted to what they hear. This is why men lie and women wear makeup, which is also a form of deception. Story 89. I feel that as a man, being aroused for a long time is not very enjoyable the longer it lasts. Arousal is fairly easy and typically involves intent. I don't think it is always the same for women. So, a 3-page erotica specifically designed for arousal resulting in masturbation would be fine. But a 500-page book? Story 90. I have read erotic literature since I was a teenager. I even wrote an erotic fantasy book, which I uploaded to Literotica because I knew there would not be much of a market for it. It is hard to find good erotic literature, as more often than not, I am not the author's target audience. Story 91. I think many people do, we just don't call it that. Instead of romance novels, it is science fiction with adult content or dark fantasy with relationship drama or, let's be honest, fan fiction when no one is looking. Story 92. Stereotypically, men are visual creatures. Personally, I have yet to find one that was not painfully poorly written or intolerably mind-numbingly dumb. Story 93. Though not a man, in a recent customer survey by an online bookseller, males made up a higher percentage of adult book readers than women, which I found amusing. Of course, I am looking for information on why women read this material. I quickly get bored with these books, as some could have a promising plot but quickly devolve into lengthy sex scenes with little else and little variety. In reality, there are only so many ways to describe intimate scenes, and my brain starts screaming, can we please get back to the story? Great observation regarding visual preferences in men versus mental preferences in women for transmitting information. Story 94. Women's romance novels involve significant elements of emotional connection and romantic themes. Story 95. I've probably read a quarter of literary erotica and alt-sex stories text repository before it shut down. I actually prefer reading to watching. I am an avid reader in general. My bookshelves have over 500 books. Story 96. No, but not because I am not aroused by the written word. The bulk of those trash romance books are worse written than the content posted on Archive of Our Own at 2 a.m. by a crossfade, under-socialized English major who desperately needs an outlet. Story 97. Men, on or off. Women volume control. Foreplay is not necessary, especially if you are alone. Most men cannot even get through the plot lead-ups in pornography. Do you think I am reading 50 Shades of Grey? Absolutely not. Story 98. I have read 2 to 3 books based on female dominance and bondage, discipline, sadism, and masochism. However, I do not think I will be reading explicit adult content anytime soon. There is a severe lack of books focused on men. Most of them are written to cater to female fantasies, and as a male, I cannot fully enjoy the graphic descriptions of what the protagonist's anatomy feels like. Story 99. Literotica, as many have said, sometimes hits just differently when you want your imagination to take you. Story 100. Books are a poor source, honestly. Online smut is much better. It is definitely different from more visual pornography. Videos are for when I'm in a rush. Reading is for when I want to enjoy it. There are also many more niche fetishes in erotica than in traditional pornography. Story 101. Most men in recent years use artificial intelligence to write all the adult stories they read. It is much better since you can tailor it to what you like or do not like. Story 102. I saw a guy reading a Sarah J. Maas book on the train, which I understand is quite popular. But generally, the answer is that we are not interested, and you would all call us perverts if we were. Story 103. We mostly do not have the patience for it. It works for women because there is much more story surrounding the erotic literature than typical modern pornography. Reading is slower than watching, which warms up their engine at the right pace. Story 104. No, there is nothing of substance in explicit material. If I am reading, it is because I want to absorb new ideas and facts, not just fill my head with garbage. Story 105. I've read books 1 and 2 of Fourth Wing. I really like the plot. I'm a sucker for anything related to dragons because they're cool. However, during the entire second book, I skipped all the explicit scenes because they felt repetitive. I also read Her Soul to Take, as it was highly recommended to me by a friend. While it contained more kink and BDSM-related scenes, it felt really strange to me. Not my thing. I used to read a lot of erotica, or rather erotic short stories, and also used those for personal stimulation. However, I did not engage with smut as in romantic fantasy or similar genres. Story 106. When I read explicit books, I felt much more uncomfortable. I did it because my ex recommended one to me. I get very invested in books and felt like I was doing something wrong in the relationship. This is just my brain, I know. But the explicit book made me feel like a cheater because it was much more intimate than pornography. This feeling is irrational, but that is how I felt. Pornography was like watching a movie. Explicit books felt like acting in one. Story 107. I like them, but they tend to be written from a female perspective and therefore focus less on physical aspects and more on personality, which can be a mixed experience. Story 108. When I was 12 to 13 years old, there was a sex forum for teens that had a section where they wrote erotica stories. That was probably my first exposure to adult content, and I loved those. Recently, I started reading some adult stories to see if I still liked them, and I can really get into it. I only don't like the trope of the guy who is a controlling jerk but also has a sweet, sensitive side, yet still ends up being a jerk. Story 109. I read much of it back then but lost interest in reading smut. It requires a lot of imagination, and I found that reading other kinds of stories suited me better. Story 110. I have been more intentional about my adult content consumption. Not just because I do not want to get addicted and reduce my reaction to actual sexual experiences, but also because a lot of adult content out there is exploitative. When watching free videos, I cannot be sure that I am viewing completely consensual acts all the time. That does not mean I do not watch adult content. I am a hypocrite too. However, I have found that with written stories, animated comics, and audio content, there are entire communities of creator consumers. Authors who are fans themselves, people who put a lot of passion and creativity into their work. And honestly, it feels better to enjoy a piece of art that someone created and is confident enough to share with others. Knowing that specific individuals with the fetishes and preferences I like are making this content to share, wow, much respect to all the creators making niche content for us. They are literally helping more people than the government. Story 111. No, I don't read smutty books or romance. I have found them to be the most predictable and reliant on tropes of all genres. I do read science fiction and fantasy. Same core plot, same beats, same characters. The dialogue is always dreadful. Again, this is coming from a fan of science fiction and fantasy. But none of those should be in this world. The whole thing seems misogynistic to me as well. I have tried recommendations from female friends. Most recently, Lights Out. I think I lasted 2 chapters. It was just not interesting to me. Romance in a book is fine. Romance as a primary motivator is fine. Romance as the whole plot is not interesting to me. Story 112. When I was a teenager, I just enjoyed reading adult books with lots of sexual content. The Seer King trilogy by Chris Bunch is basically sword and sorcery erotica, which was fun. Story 113. I've read some literary erotica, Miller's Rosy Crucifixion trilogy, Salter's A Sport and a Pastime, Nabokov's Ada, though this is a fundamentally different tradition than the kind of erotic romance novels you were talking about. I read them as literary fiction that explores the texture of sexuality and desire rather than as pornography. Otherwise, you rarely hear about it because it is very uncommon, to the point where it becomes a feedback loop. Almost only women read romance novels, so romance novels are basically only written to women's fantasies, leading to mostly women reading them. This applies to explicit ones as much as chaste ones. In the same way there are women who get pleasure from very male-centric video pornography, there are men who enjoy erotic romance novels. I am not counting men who try out their girlfriend's romance novels and find they do not appeal much, but the number is not significant. Story 114. Many years ago, a friend who ran an online erotic magazine was bemoaning how she could never get male authors to write explicit content. Being between jobs, I gave it a try. I looked through what was already published and all the works were written by female authors from a female point of view, aimed very squarely at a female and nearly always heterosexual readership. I suspect the same is true of books. If there are no books that cater to your tastes and desires, it is unlikely you will read them. One of the things I really enjoy is writing for someone I am seeing or flirting with. These often turn into story exchanges, which is probably as close as I come to reading explicit books. Story 115. It might just be the genres I prefer, but I can count on one hand the well-written sex scenes I have read throughout hundreds of books. I feel the same way about television series and movies. Who wants to see two people dry humping? Get it over with and move on with the plot. Story 116. The only time I have read it is when my girlfriend and I read together. I have no real interest in romance as the main storyline. Romance storylines in other books are fine. This discussion has been had before and it boils down to this. Most men do not fantasize about romance. Men fantasize about big, exciting things, and there is usually an attractive woman involved at some point, but she is not the main focus. Story 117. I read them. But more importantly, I write them too. I have been writing adult fiction for 30 years, as far back as the days on the old Usenet alt.sex.stories newsgroup. These days, there is a thriving community of readers and writers on places like Literotica or storiesonline.net. I prefer the latter. Storiesonline.net probably has more male readers and writers than female, which is reflected in the type of stories found there. Commercial adult fiction is generally aimed at women because they purchase more of it. Men's fantasy literature tends, this is not a strict rule but a trend, towards areas that most commercial sites avoid or ban outright. Story 118. No, but I've been curious about it. My problem is not that it would not work on me. I'm pretty sure audio works and written books could interest me. The problem is that searching for content targeted to my taste is impossible. Such content is not really aimed at a rather vanilla heterosexual man. Additionally, visual media works faster and better, which decreases my motivation to search for audio or book content. Basically, audio and book formats are a big hassle to find content matching my tastes, with results that are not really better than what my imagination and some visual media can already provide. Story 119. I don't read them, nor do any of my male friends. Personally, there is a fine line in erotica between being erotic and ridiculous, and in my humble opinion, almost all writers cross it. If I read Ebony God, again to refer to a black man, or his manhood pulsed when he felt her hand on his back, I will be disgusted. In general, I think most men do not read it because it is written for women by women with some inaccuracies regarding the male body, and because reading something erotic is seen as objectifying women and being from the male perspective. Story 120. You do not hear it because there is not an entire TikTok or other social media community set up to discuss men reading adult fiction. It is generally because, culturally, women's sexuality is romanticized and celebrated, while men's is more often considered sketchy or threatening. So, while many men are reading it, they are not typically broadcasting it. Story 121. Stephen King is erotica for men, and there is plenty of very specific fetish erotica available for men if you dare to look. Story 122. Yes, I read some and write some, but I honestly don't think too often. When I do, I engage with it. Although I am only 8 pages into 50 Shades after many years, I just cannot continue. The style makes me cringe long before I get to any explicit content. Story 123. I do, but I would never admit it to anyone. The trick for me is that I read on my phone, and no one knows what I am reading, and I do not read that kind of content around other people. Pornography is much more noticeable and cannot be confused for anything else, making it more easily caught. Written adult fiction, on the other hand, can be mistaken for normal literature and can easily fly under the radar. There is plenty of male/female explicit fan fiction. There are also gone wild stories that are quite popular. Story 124. For me, it is usually adult manga. The story and art add a lot. I would not know where to begin with actual published books. Story 125. Those types of books are usually aimed at women, and I never gravitated toward them. However, I have not read anything in a while. I do enjoy textual role-playing and reading erotic stories, so I think I would enjoy them. Story 126. Well, I'm dipping my toes and trying to write some adult fiction, but I'm terrible at it. I've never read adult fiction books. The closest thing would be Japanese animated adult content, but I already know how that sounds. Seriously, some are really good stories. Story 127. Does creatine smut with chat generative pre-trained transformer count? I don't read smut books but read smut made by artificial intelligence roleplay. I guess it's more like your name from Archive of Our Own, but you have more control over the plot. Story 128. I think the issue is regarding sexual excitement. Men in general are excited visually and women mentally. For entertainment and excitement purposes, men look at images, while women read the words. Having a book story based around sex would not have much interest for a man. If there is some sex in the book as part of an overall story, men will not mind, but many of the explicit books are primarily written to target the explicit section. Story 129. I read whatever excites my partner, so I can better understand what turns her on. I also write explicit stories myself. The only reason this is possible is because I read very quickly. I can finish most novels in less than a day. Story 130. I'm sure some do, but just like pornography is made to appeal to men, those romance novels are made to appeal to women. Story 131. I tried a romantasy book. The protagonist had the safe, lifelong male friend who had unreciprocated romantic feelings for her, and then the bad boy who is dangerous but wants to protect the protagonist. The male friend does not trust the bad boy, and they argue over the protagonist. I think I would need to be attracted to men in order to enjoy that. Altered Carbon has graphic sex scenes. It seems targeted towards straight and bisexual men, but I was not really interested in those scenes either. Maybe it is just not for me, or maybe I have not found good smutty content for people who are into women. Story 132. Yes, literotica. Not usually for happy, fun solo times outright, but some titillation is nice while chilling out. Plus, a number of the authors there actually publish solid science fiction. Story 133. If they made summarized versions, you might be on to something. Books are too long. That said, I could probably get into them, but what is the point? At the end of the day, it is still just me. Story 134. Not a full book, but most of my erotic materials are short stories, comics, and audio. Most pornography is underwhelming, and if I do look at something, it is usually just solo nude images of women whose bodies I like. I think it may have to do with the difference in most men having spontaneous desire, whereas most women have responsive desire. If you are responsive, you need time to get into the appropriate headspace. If you are spontaneous, once you are aroused, everything that is not specifically sexual just pulls you out of it. I have read some of my girlfriend's erotic writing just to see what the hype is, haunting Adeline, plus something her niece lent her that she said she did not care for, and it did not do anything for me. But that makes sense. They are written to appeal to heterosexual women. As a man, they are good for taking notes if some scene really excites her, but that is about it. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.